AJ Garrett here from Underwood Systems, and I'm coming to you from a beautiful English garden from sunny Gosport, Stokes Bay area on the south coast of England. Coming to you with another Camp X Secrets video spot on the connection between Bill Underwood and Camp X. You know, an interesting historical note about where I am right now in Gosport, or in the Stokes Bay area. This area represented the largest concentration of Canadian troops in World War II, as again, watercraft equipment, weapon systems and so forth were being put together here in the Gosport area to be staged for Operation Overlord or for the D-Day invasion. Some amazing history. This is where they built the Mulberry Harbors. I tried to get out actually to shoot a little bit of video directly on the ocean, and too much wind just wasn't gonna work. So I'm very, very close by, and again, a beautiful English garden. I've been researching Bill Underwood and the Camp X subject matter for about 20 years. And one of the most important things to me is this has been also in connection with the world's expert on Camp X, Lynn Philip Hodgson. I've been corrected more recently, 43 years of research into the subject matter as far as that goes. And from the very beginning in researching Underwood, one of the things I found was that Camp X kept coming up as subject matter or subject matter reference within Bill Underwood's story, even before I understood what Camp X was, all right? And to get right down to it, Bill Underwood claimed many times, and to various people, students and instructors of him and associates in the post-war years, that in fact, he absolutely was an instructor at a place called Camp X in Oshawa, Ontario. I've come across most certainly Canadian and American military and intelligence veterans who've absolutely testified to the same. And I would argue that one of the things that is as important is the fact that when you understand the organic day-to-day of what was going on at that time or during that day, that it makes all the sense in the world that in fact Underwood was utilized as an asset, okay, to teach at the camp during that time. I believe that when you understand that, it takes more actual faith to believe he wasn't there than he was, okay? So in breaking it down, you know, Bill Underwood testified to many people that in fact he was involved at Camp X. In some cases, I'm going to share a few stories with you because they're amazing stories and bring to light some excellent history. In some cases, I've got permission to use or reference a name. In other cases, I don't, so I won't. One particular gentleman from the Toronto area who was a Defendo student of Bill's, got to know him quite well, had an amazing story when he found me to share about his relationship with Bill. He was training with Bill in Defendo in the 1960s, got to know him pretty well, and invited Bill out to some lunch, basically on after a weekend training. And when they got together and sat down, he started asking Bill about World War II and Combato and some of those types of things. And Underwood said to him very clearly, he said, well, you know what, I was an instructor at a place called Camp X, and it was involved in, you know, basically special ops, okay, or the, you know, more secret operations. And he said everybody at that camp needed to learn unarmed combat or self-protection type skill sets. And so this is, you know, what I was there for, and I was very involved at camp. I met Fairburn there and did some work with William Fairburn, all right? And he said to me, actually, I didn't even know who Fairburn was until I researched it, you know, researched Fairburn after that. So, you know, certainly an amazing point of reference. Another gentleman who not only was a Defendo student of Bill's in the 1960s, all right, was also Bill Underwood's paper boy on Avenue Road. If you know much about Bill's history, Bill lived on Avenue Road for a number of years, and there's a reason for that. That actually paints a direct connection between Bill Underwood and the Underwood family and the Avro Arrow story, the Avro Arrow Fighter Interceptor, which is something I'll probably shoot a little video on as well. But essentially, when Underwood was living on Avenue Road, this gentleman was his paper boy. And he said, you know, I knew Bill and Kathleen well and got along with them very well. And he said one day, as a kid, I remember turning on the television and saw a vignette with basically for the Canadian Air Force. And here was Bill Underwood teaching some self-defense unarmed combat. He said, I got all excited because that was Mr. Bill, as I called him at the time. And I jumped on my bike and rode over to his apartment and went upstairs, and he and Kathleen were home, and essentially said, Mr. Bill, did I just see you on TV? And Bill chuckled and brought him in and gave him a Pepsi kind of thing, and sat down, and he said, yeah, that was me. And then, you know, started to talk, and he invited him out to some Defendo training. He said, I trained with Bill for a number of years, and he said at the conclusion of that, I kind of disappeared into my later teen years and got busy with girls and, you know, driving cars and all that kind of stuff. And he said a number of years after that, I came back and Bill was still there and had a nice, happy reunion with him and Kathleen. And he said, I wanted to talk to Bill because I was going into the Canadian Forces. I was about to go into basic training in Petawawa. And he said, I came over to see Bill and said, Bill, listen, my life could be on the line. Would you be at all willing to teach Combato? And at first he said no. It took a total of 3 visits. And at the end of that, Bill said, listen, you're just not going to give up on this, are you? He said, no, I'm not. He said, okay. So he said, Bill brought me into a back room at that apartment, closed the door. He said, look, take a seat. And I sat on a chair, and he said he opened a closet and brought down a wooden box, okay, from the top of that closet. And when he opened it up, inside it was a Fairbairn Sykes knife. And he said, Bill went on to describe how at Camp X, when he taught there, he worked with an instructor by the name of William Fairbairn. He said, I learned knife from William Fairbairn. I want to show you how to defend yourself with a knife, okay, how to dispatch someone with a knife. And so these are some of the things that he went through. So I mean, some phenomenal history. Canadian Forces veteran by the name of Reggie went out to a book launch that Lynn had given and was lecturing on Camp X, and then had a chat with Lynn afterwards, identifying the fact that he was a World War II veteran. And when they were chatting, Reggie identified the fact that Bill Underwood was his instructor for unarmed combat and self-defense and so forth during World War II. He said, well, I've got a guy that you need to talk to, which of course is referencing me and the research I was doing on Underwood. And as I got a chance to spend some time with Reggie and talk to him, he said, oh yeah, he said Underwood was amazing. Talked about Bill's character and his physicality and some of those things, and said, we all knew at the time that obviously Bill was training our regular force assets for war, or for the military, ramping up to in World War II. He said, but we all knew, and we're kind of whispering about the fact that there was a secret camp. There was some project that was going on in the Oshawa area, way out in the boonies, which Oshawa was at that time. I mean, the woods was was Scarborough during those days, for crying out loud. And so he said, we all knew that Underwood was teaching out there as well. So the whispers around the locker room when we were getting ready, for training or after training was, well, this stuff is amazing. We really wonder what Bill's teaching those guys out, in that, and who were involved in that secret project, in the Oshawa area. So these are the things that, certainly, abounded by way of reference to Bill at the camp. There are certainly more. I'm just sharing a handful, with you. But one of the ones that I believe is absolutely the most important is essentially words shared with me from Joe Lazarski, a legendary OSS CIA veteran. And essentially, I had the privilege in 2004 of representing Lynn Phillip Hodgson at the 2004 OSS reunion in Washington. When OSS was a little bit more closed doors, during those years. And in getting a chance to talk with Joe, when I asked him, obviously, listen, did you ever know or train with a gentleman by the name of Bill Underwood? His eyes automatically lit up. He says, oh gosh, I knew Bill. He said, absolutely. I said, okay, Joe, describe him for me, his personality, his physicality. I mean, physically, what was he like? He described Underwood right down to his boots. He said, I knew Underwood well. He said, I was a training partner for Bill. Joe said, I was one of the 3 skis at Area B. That was kind of a nickname that he was given. He said, I did teach unarmed combat. One of my initial instructors was Bill Underwood. And he said Underwood was down, teaching at the OSS, areas, and through his travels in the States and so forth, he was working with a lot of other American assets, and he listed a few like American Air Force and so forth, some other assets that Bill was involved in. And he said, our connection with Bill that we absolutely understood was that Bill was teaching up at Camp X in Oshawa. We knew he was teaching SOE and our OSS boys up there, and that was the connection. And that's again coming from a very celebrated OSS and CIA veteran, automatically and absolutely painting that connection between Bill and the camp. Now, one of the things I've found when it comes to contending with Camp X subject matter is 2 things. And for me, how people often handle these 2 issues when it comes to Camp X documentation or history tells me usually whether they have any kind of an understanding of really what went on at the camp or the nature of the history of Camp X, or whether they're just what I refer to as an armchair historian. They read a book or 2 and fancy themselves as, being an expert on the subject matter. First and foremost is, there needs to be an understanding that if we're talking about the history of Special and Black operations, you are not going to have a tremendous amount of information on a lot of different related subject matter. It's just not going to be there. And this is certainly the case with Camp X. And what I'm referring to is folks that look at, basic pieces of documentation and say, well, if it's not said here, it's not here. We don't have it on paper here. It didn't exist. My goodness, you don't understand the nature of the subject matter. Okay. And even more particularly when it came to SOE or BSc or Sir William Stevenson, as I've said before, Stevenson took 90% of his files. Okay. They were woven into a treatment called the Camp X Bible. Okay. Which was compiled at the Genosha Hotel in Oshawa. And then again, 90% of those records were burned and destroyed at Camp X. Stevenson was so compartmentalized, and he never shared those files ever, okay, with the UK, with the SOE in the UK, which, as I've said before, why we still have today, in my opinion, some older veterans that don't think a lot of Stevenson. He was kind of the bastard child, okay, that was not British. He wasn't under British politics or the money flow, which I would argue is one of the reasons why he chose Sir William Stevenson for the North American BSc SOE projects, as far as that went, okay. But again, those files, if they did exist, the largest portion of them were destroyed. And a lot of things at the camp, according to the veterans, okay, staff and agents of the camp, were never documented. It was too dangerous for them to do that. There's a lot of people and happenings at the camp that occurred that were never documented. So my point is, if you're going to look at, connections of people sometimes as subject matter to the camp, okay, and purely point a finger at, well, if there's not a piece of paper on this, you just don't understand the subject matter. Okay, there's a number of other variables that come into play in painting an accurate history, or as an accurate picture as we can paint, as far as what went on, okay, at the camp. Secondly, another issue when it comes to these types of things is to see if someone understands the complexity of the documentation or lack of documentation when it comes to the unarmed combat training tradecraft. Okay, and let's get into this. Most people don't understand this, whatsoever, and this certainly paints a picture, again, for the reason of involvement of someone like Bill Underwood at Camp X. When people look at generic paperwork on Camp X of what we have, William Fairburn, of course, is painted as a chief instructor on camp. George Sherwilla-Wisco is there as a support instructor in that capacity. And Fairburn absolutely deserves every bit of accolade that he can get. He is the grandfather of Western combination combatives and firearms. I mean, Fairburn arguably created the first template for SWAT, okay, out of Shanghai Municipal Police Force, was transferred into the States, Delano, and then LAPD, Delano 68, LAPD 69, FBI 7071 under Clint Gunther and a couple of the guys there that established SWAT for the FBI. Okay, so Fairburn in the larger picture certainly is the overall godfather. I mean, Fairburn was, one of the founding, absolutely North American grandfathers in unarmed combat. So my point is that, again, people think Camp X then, they think Fairburn, Fairburn, Fairburn. All right, here's what's not understood most often when it comes to these dynamics between Fairburn and Sherwilla-Wisco, the other instructor on paper at the camp. First of all, Fairburn was not there at the beginning of the camp. All right. When the camp opened in December of '41, it was Sherwilla-Wisco that actually taught the first couple of classes through, composed of mostly Americans, COI, FBI, and so forth. All right. But Fairburn wasn't even at the camp until April of '42, and he only taught there for a few months, okay, until he was seconded to the OSS and then left the camp in the summer of 1942. All right. So the chief instructor that we have on paper that so many people point a finger at was only there for a number of months. Okay. No. So through the duration of the camp, then, would it have been possible for Fairburn to handle the OSS activity and training? Okay, and what was going on at Camp X? Well, we do know he came back in 1943, and I would think that he made some trips, definitely back and forth. But there is no way, and this comes from, a professional career of coming up in 20 years and teaching in special operations communities from within our allied, circles, having that background. There is no way Fairburn could have handled, okay, not only unarmed combat, but the shooting, CQB, if we will, some of the other skill sets, training of agents, have handled all of that himself, okay, within the American areas for the OSS that we're, again, building and growing, and that of what SOE needed at Camp X. There's no way Fairburn could have handled that and gone back and forth, back and forth, back. There's just absolutely no way that could have occurred in that capacity. So, okay, well, what about Sherwilla-Wisco then? That's what he was there for. Well, hold on. George passed away. He actually passed away within 1 calendar year of the opening of the camp. He passed away of health issues at the end of 1942 in England, went back to England. Okay, so here we've got, the camp existing till 44, okay, okay, until really the Allies pushed so far into Europe that they just didn't require the agents anymore for the types of SOE activities that had been conducted, and then the focus went on to do, Commando Bay and the Eastern Theater for a very short period of time before the war was finished. But the reality is that even Torella Wisco was there for 1 year, basically. Who else helped out? Who else was involved in this equation? And as I said, this to me tells me whether someone really does understand the nature of practical Camp X history, which I again will say, this comes from the life work of Lynn Phillip Hodgson, our organic understanding of these things. All right. Well, this is again where Bill Underwood comes into frame with this. I've already again painted stories and connections to Bill, and Camp X in this regard, but in every practical sense, it makes sense that he was chosen. Number one, well, why is it then, for example, that Underwood would have such a practical solution here? Well, I absolutely discovered a connection between him and the British Security Coordination starting in about 1940. He was recruited at the World's Fair, and I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'll shoot another video spot on Bill's connection to BSC, which is again another entirely different matter. But Bill was already in the trust tree, and he was the most influential, combatives pioneer. He was in the circles, he was known, he was in the trust tree, if you will, okay? And he was out of Toronto, an hour from the camp. I mean, this is why I make a comment that if you understand the need of what was going on there, and if you think Underwood wouldn't have been used for that, who else would they have risked this with? Who else was in proximity to be able to do any of these things, okay? Or who else was in that trust tree? It's extremely practical and makes sense that Underwood filled that role. And wrapping up lastly, well, why do we not know as much about Underwood as we do about, Fairbairn, Sykes, O'Neill, and some of these others? There's some very practical reasons for that, in my opinion. Number one, Underwood was Canadian, okay? Canadians do not have a history of trumpeting their own when it comes to history. I've had so many times Americans make the comment to me that, yeah, we know of Underwood and he was one of our pioneers, absolutely. But man, I tell you, if Underwood was American, we'd have, museums to the guy. It's just not in the Canadian nature to celebrate those things. Number two, Underwood was involved at the very inset of the impartation of these skills, okay? It was very cutting edge, very new, and it was a very dire time, okay? And they needed to train the boys to get on boats within weeks to deal with the combat judo and jiu-jitsu of the day, and to have these protective life and death skills. The focus wasn't as much on posterity. It was very much on get the skills into the guys, get them going. And by the time the war really got into a stride and the American machine got involved in 1942, the lights, camera, action of everything started to focus on American assets. All right, so there's very many reasons why, okay, Underwood absolutely has not been trumpeted. However, I've always found if you get in the circles of those that have trained with Applegate or Fairbairn originally or any of those types, they all talked about Underwood and said the original grandfathers talked about Bill. He was the first in North America. That's been my experience in regard to that. So again, some really interesting history, and my heart and my intent in sharing this obviously is not to take away from anyone, whether it's Fairbairn, Applegate, any of the World War II grandfathers, but to give Underwood some needed recognition. I believe this is absolutely the organic truth as far as what went on at the camp. And Underwood, Bill, we certainly salute you for that and pay you some tribute.